After the birth of my son, I decided that whenever I was around him, I needed to do my very best to be a perfect father. What that meant was to try to shield him from the ugly realities of life. I made a promise to him, as well as myself, to only ever expose him to beautiful things, to show him that the world was a wonderful place, full of amazing stuff, not disgusting and grotesque things. I was also very mindful not to fill his head with imaginary things, stuff like the Easter Bunny or Santa Claus. That might seem strange, but here's my logic. Those things are imaginary, and what it means is that if I told him a lie, when he got older, I would have to break his heart by telling him it was a lie, and I just couldn't bring myself to do that. Instead, I just encouraged him to be imaginative, to create those wonderful and exciting things for himself, and I was very lucky that my family was supportive. They never filled his head with things like the tooth fairy and stuff like that. But as soon as my son started kindergarten, that all changed. I would pick my son up from school and he'd be telling me about the Easter Bunny, or any other such character that coincided with the current upcoming holiday. Even though this frustrated me quite a bit, I figured it wasn't doing him any harm. After all, it wasn't me lying to him, and it's not like the kids were aware that they were lying either. They were just being misinformed by their parents, and since holidays are a fun thing, I actually thought it would be okay. But that all changed. My son made a new friend at school named Donovan. They were exactly the same age, and I guess maybe that's why they got along so well. Something about synchronicity and matching birthdays. I only met Donovan a handful of times when I picked my kid up from school. He seemed like a very nice boy, but something about him seemed kind of odd. He began telling my son about the Boogeyman. Again, I wasn't entirely keen with anyone filling my child's head with lies, but holiday mascots aside, I found this one to be particularly disturbing. Donovan began telling my son stories about the Boogeyman, stories about how he would hide in your closet or under your bed, and if you were naughty, sometimes he would come out from his hiding spots and stand over your bed and watch you as you slept in the middle of the night. I kept trying to reassure my son that Donovan was just pulling his leg, and that it was just a story, complete make-believe. I tried to convince him for the better part of 4 weeks that there was no such thing as the Boogeyman. But since my son and Donovan got along so well, I couldn't convince my son otherwise. After all, Donovan wasn't technically lying to him. Someone else had filled his head with that nonsense. After a while, my son started having night terrors. Almost every single night, he would come into my room crying, his heart racing inside his tiny chest, complaining that there was something in his closet. He'd be absolutely terrified and 100% convinced that he had done something wrong and that the Boogeyman was waiting for him and going to hurt him. For the next several weeks, I did my best to put up with it. I really just wanted my kid to start sleeping in his own bed again and not be afraid, so I thought perhaps it would be a good idea if Donovan came over to have a sleepover with him. I met up with Donovan's dad at the school and spoke with him about having his son stay over for the night. I can't begin to tell you how relieved I was when I saw my son smile ear to ear at the mention of this. Donovan seemed to smile just as big, if not bigger, and they both seemed super excited about it. It was around 6 p.m. that night when Donovan's father dropped him off. I let him and my son play video games for a couple of hours while I watched TV in the other room. They were having a great time, and this made me super happy because I figured my son would just sort of wear himself out, and both of them would sleep through the night. I went to bed a little earlier than usual and told him not to stay up too late. At some point in the middle of the night, both my son and Donovan came into my room crying. I asked them what was going on and what was the matter. and they both told me the exact same thing. They said that they thought the boogeyman was hiding in the closet, and that he was going to hurt them. I just wanted to ease their minds and hopefully get them back to bed. So I took them both back to my son's room, turned on all the lights, and showed them the inside of the closet. I even walked in and out of it a few times to show them there was nothing there, and therefore no reason to be afraid. At this point, my son went to get a drink of water from the bathroom, and Donovan said something to me that I found extremely disturbing. He told me that the reason he was so afraid that night was because right before his father dropped him off, he had told him that he needed to behave and not make any trouble. Donovan's father had told him that a string of recent murders inside the city had been done by the boogeyman, and that if he didn't behave that night, the boogeyman would be coming for him next. I tried very unsuccessfully to tell Donovan that there was no such thing as the boogeyman, and how horrible I thought it was that his father would say something like that to him. But then Donovan said something very strange. He told me he had seen the boogeyman a few nights earlier inside of his closet. He said this had happened on a night when he had accidentally broken a plate at dinner time. His father yelled at him and sent him to bed early. At some point during the night, Donovan woke up to the sound of his closet door opening. He said he saw a dark figure exit the closet and stand over his bed, making a strange raspy sound as it breathed. He said the face of this thing looked really grotesque and disfigured, like a damaged Halloween mask. I stayed up the rest of the night with both the boys, because at this point, they were too terrified to sleep, and I was way too frustrated with Donovan's father. It's not that I didn't believe what Donovan was telling me. I actually did. But I knew there had to be more to this story than what he was telling me. The next night, I called Donovan's father and invited him to the house for coffee. I sent my son to bed early so that we could talk without being interrupted. By the time he got to my house, he looked like he had already had a fair amount to drink. We started the conversation off by talking about sports and whatnot, just making small talk. What I really wanted to do was get a good sense of what type of father he was. Something in his mannerisms told me that he was abusive. I never saw any bruises or marks on Donovan's body, but to be honest, I hadn't really been looking for them. But I could definitely tell that there was some sort of emotional abuse happening. The more we talked, the more I started to detest this man. I then told him I wanted to talk to him about something that Donovan had said during the sleepover. I asked him point blank, "Have you been telling your son about the boogeyman?" He said yes. "Haven't you ever told your son about that whenever he does something bad and you want him to behave?" I told him absolutely not. I would never do anything like that to my child, so how could you? He then told me about all the things Donovan had done, which, to be honest with you, I don't think merited what he was telling him. Not picking up toys, broken dishes, all things that kids are guilty of. Nothing that warrants being traumatized by their father. I then asked him about what Donovan had told me about seeing the boogeyman inside of his closet, and just how convinced he was of it. I asked him if he had let Donovan watch any scary movies or anything like that, to which he replied absolutely not. But he did admit something. He admitted that on that night that Donovan saw the boogeyman hiding in his closet, that it was actually him, dressed up in a Halloween mask and a black coat. He said he was just trying to teach his son a lesson, and that he really wasn't a bad parent for doing it. He tried to justify it by saying a lot of parents did things like that, and their kids turned out just fine. I then explained to him how concerned I was that my son had been hearing these things. I tried to reason with him and explain to him that we need to be raising our kids to see the world as a wonderful place, an exciting place, and we need to let kids be kids, not fill their heads with such horrible garbage. He, of course, got extremely defensive, which was to be expected. If the tables were turned, I probably would have gotten defensive as well. I put my cup of coffee down on the table, and then I said to him, "I need to ask you something else. In all this time you were playing the boogeyman, scaring your child like that, did you also tell your son that the boogeyman was responsible for all those murders that were happening inside the city?" I was a bit surprised when he chuckled at this. I didn't find it funny at all, but he seemed to. He said yes. I pretended to be the boogeyman. And yes, I told my son that the boogeyman was going around town and killing people that were misbehaving. Why is that such a bad thing? I then looked him square in the eye, and I told him the last words he would ever hear before I broke his neck. "I don't like when people take credit for my work."